Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Ibutiti Anaerobic Processed Kenya from Kawa Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kawa, based out of Paris, France, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel twice before, having previously reviewed one of their El Paraiso coffees, as well as a Mosto Processed Ethiopia, which to this moment still remains one of my favorite Ethiopian coffees of the entire year. So it's safe to say, as soon as I saw a local coffee shop carrying their coffee again, it's definitely caught my interest, and it was something I wanted to try. And I'll be completely honest with what happened on this coffee. When I was looking through the coffees, I saw that this was a Kenyan, and I saw that it had a kiwi flavor note. So I just went ahead and purchased it, not knowing it was an anaerobic coffee. I assumed it was a washed, and I really wanted to review a wash processed Kenyan, given that we had not reviewed a wash processed coffee from Kawa to this point. So my mistake, and when I got home and noticed that, I said, you know what, I've had good experiences with Kawa to this point, so it's entirely possible that this will be another pretty positive experience. So I'm looking forward to discussing another Kawa coffee. This right here is day 28 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 201 degree Fahrenheit. And I like this one better through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for Kawa, this coffee, and I'll discuss this on our first day, it had a visually lighter appearance than typical for anaerobic coffees, so I will call this a European light for the roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 7, first impression, and I knew that the coffee was probably too early to be consumed at this point, but I was in desperation mode, so I had to drink something. And one of the first things I noticed was that the beans were just visually lighter than typical for a lot of these anaerobic processed coffees. Now, in all of these videos now, we include a photo of what the beans actually look like. So it might be difficult to tell based off of this photo, but just from a visual impression, you can definitely see that this one's just a little lighter than typical for so many of these anaerobic processed coffees, even from some coffee roasters that traditionally roast pretty light themselves. And as a result, I was experiencing a fair bit of lightness in the cup as well. It was somewhat cleaner than I think I was expecting, especially for what it was. Pretty heavily apple forward. Decent first impression, felt that maybe a lot of rest would be needed. Day 9, of course, still in desperation mode, so went back immediately, and the cup is surprisingly good for what it was. It almost reminds me of apple juice with a cleaner strawberry finish to it. So it was on the slightly cleaner side for what I was expecting. The cup is pretty vibrant with a fair bit of sweetness as well. That's the much more expected aspect of this cup of coffee. So to this point, we're thinking, okay, it's pretty decent, especially for being in these earlier days. Day 11, seeing an overall increase in the vibrancy of the cup, and here's where we started to get what I was expecting a lot more from this cup of coffee, as the apple aspect continues to become the most defining characteristic, but at this point it's become a lot more sweet and a lot more lasting and a lot more well-fermenty in general, as I was getting a little bit more of the more robust berry that was coming from it as opposed to the slightly cleaner strawberry earlier on in this cup of coffee, so it wasn't necessarily trending in the best direction. And when we went back on day 13, adjustments haven't improved the coffee, as I did lower the temperature and I did kind of increase the ratio, so 16.67, to see if maybe I can just kind of tone this coffee down. But it's become a lot more robust. And this has been a consistent theme with these anaerobic coffees, is you can make all the adjustments you want to kind of tone them down, but once they reach a certain window, they just become too vibrant and just very intense overall. So that's the difference I noticed on this day. Likely indicator that the coffee is just opening up in general and it's become a lot heavier. Day 15, cup continues to intensify, and I attempted a bypass because bypass has worked well in previous instances, and it didn't necessarily help with this cup of coffee. It just toned it down, but in general it was losing a lot of its earlier cleanliness and just was still really heavy in this sense. So I didn't necessarily enjoy the bypass with this coffee. Once again, we're experiencing some just very sweet and long-lasting flavors that are a little overbearing at this point. So I said, hey, we're just going to sit this coffee for a little bit and see if maybe there's a bit of improvement with some time. And we went back to it a week later, day 22, and the week has done some nice things for this cup of coffee. Is at this point, it's a lot more balanced out. And much of the heaviness is more even, and a little bit of the cleanliness has returned to the cup. And it does seem to have some pretty vibrant citrus fruit once again, in addition to a candy sweetness. Basically, the best way I feel like I could describe this coffee is that it very much tastes like a hard apple candy, but in addition to that, it tastes like an artificially flavored kiwi. And they list on here the kiwi flavor note, and I've rarely ever gotten actual kiwi from a cup of coffee. I feel like there are very few coffees that actually taste like a kiwi fruit itself, but plenty of them taste like that artificial flavor of kiwi in general. So kind of like the strawberry kiwi, which is a very common thing. I could definitely see that in this cup of coffee, but in terms of just like a fresh kiwi fruit, not quite, not for me anyway, but I've never really experienced that, so I guess that's not too surprising. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And I actually purposely avoided looking at this tasting wheel because I haven't seen it in a while and I'm curious to see what it looks like myself, so we will see. The acidity at level 5, though, I knew that that was the one defining characteristic to this cup of coffee because, yeah, it was definitely a very acidic cup of coffee. I don't think that that was surprising in any sense for a number of reasons, one being that it was a pretty apple-forward cup of coffee. But in addition to that, it was a Kenyan coffee and it was an anaerobic processed Kenyan coffee. So I think that's the only... There might have been other coffees that have scored in that level before, but this one definitely justified it. It was a very acidic cup of coffee. Berry fruit and citrus fruit, level 4. Yeah, I've kind of been alluding to the strawberry, and if they would have put a strawberry flavor note on here, it would have made a lot of sense to me because I got it in two aspects, both a slightly cleaner one, a more artificial one, and in addition to that, a more heavy, robust berry. So that's why I feel like the berry there is definitely justified at level 4 for me anyway. And then the citrus fruit, that's going to be that kind of apple, and I'm not entirely sure where I would put the kiwi in this, but it's going to fall into one of those two categories. So regardless, this artificially flavored kiwi that I'm experiencing, it would go in either of those two regardless. But I don't think either of them were the most intense or strong thing that I've ever experienced. Like, I don't think either of them were overbearing. Even in its heaviest days, they were still somewhat a little bit more toned down. So I think that neither of them justify a level 5, but that level 4 is pretty good. It was still pretty strong and intense. Sweetness and finish, level 4. Yeah, higher side of the level 4 for both of those, but once again, it wasn't as overbearing and strong as so many of the anaerobic coffees I've had. So if you can keep these anaerobic coffees below a 5 for both of those things, then I think we're actually in a pretty decent direction. And probably the thing that we must discuss the most is those, well, level 3s right there, the cleanliness as well as the bitterness. So the bitterness, I'm trying to figure out where I was necessarily experiencing that, because I'm not experiencing that in as strong of abundance today. I think I'd probably lower that down to a 2. It's a little bitter. The fruit that's coming from it has a little bit of bitterness to it. But the cleanliness, level 3. I touched on that in the earlier days. It was a cleaner cup of coffee than I think I was expecting. I think this is a very relative cleanliness for level 3, because there have been times I've bumped some coffees up to a level 2, these anaerobic coffees to a level 2. This might be the cleanest anaerobic coffee I think I've had, one that just labels itself straight anaerobic, especially given that it is a Kenyan coffee. It does have a more clean, clear, defined profile than I'm used to from these coffees, and I think you can see that in the rest of the representation of this wheel, having a lot of the stronger aspects toned down, so that's why it is at that level 3. Probably a little generous, probably on the lower side of that level 3, but I still think it's justified nonetheless. So I actually agree with my tasting wheel. I think it looks pretty decent, body lower. Yeah, I don't think there's too much else worth discussing in it. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think having revisited it twice after some initial early less than positive impressions, it kind of reminded me that this coffee and Kawa in general is what I would describe as a little better than I think I'm used to from a lot of other coffee roasters. So when it comes to most other coffee roasters, I have an expectation for them, having not had too many of Kawa's coffees. I think that they do a better job than most other coffee roasters with most of their coffees. So given that the Paraiso coffee is a coffee I've had from other coffee roasters before, and I thought that Kawa did a better job of it, I've had that Chantuini from other coffee roasters before, and I think that Kawa did a better job of it, and I've had some really heavily processed Kenyan coffees, and I've noticed that Kawa's done a better job of it as well. So I'm seeing a theme here that, at the very least, for what your expectation for a lot of these coffees are, I think Kawa's going a bit above it in almost all of these instances, because this one wasn't too overbearing. I thought it was a pretty decent one overall, especially given some kind of mid impressions that I wasn't necessarily enjoying from this coffee. But towards the end, I think I can appreciate it for what it is. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think that this one is on the better side of those heavily processed anaerobic coffees. So I think if you really like that strong artificial flavor to it, that acidity is a real sticking point to me. It's a real big thing in this cup of coffee, so keep that part in mind as well. But if you really like that kind of strawberry kiwi candy, I feel like this is a pretty good fit for you. It has so much sweetness to it. If you like these really strong fruit bombs in general and don't mind the kind of heaviness that comes from these anaerobic processed coffees, then this one is probably a pretty decent fit for you as well. But for the most part, I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Kawa, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ibutiti Anaerobic Processed Kenya from Kawa Coffee. Thank you for watching.